Hi everybody, welcome to our first lecture for EDLE 5473, Supervision of Instruction. We're going to be starting with Chapter 1 of the Sullivan and Glantz textbook, which is all that I'm expecting you to do for the first real week of class. This is going to be a longer lecture. The material in here I think is important, and I think me not overdoing it in the beginning will end up helping you. But I really want to focus on this material, and I want it to be something that sticks in your mind. One thing that I do need to mention real quick, the PowerPoint that is posted to D2L, that remember my goal with these lectures are you have the PowerPoint open or printed while you're listening to me talk or you're watching the lecture. When the room I'm recording in right now is not conducive to white background, black text, so it looks different, but I promise you this is the Chapter 1 presentation. So this class is difficult to teach, but it's why I want to teach it, because it's going to give you two different perspectives. It's going to give you curriculum on one hand and leadership on the other, and you have to merge those two together. There's a curriculum perspective and a leadership perspective. In this book, in the introductory stuff really focuses on curriculum, which I think is good for all of you regardless of your program. I'm a functionalist, and you'll hear me say that quite frequently in my teaching. I do what I can to fit to the situation as it's needed and make whatever I need to make happen and work in whatever organization that I'm working in. When you're doing observation of teachers, there are going to be some areas that you're extremely strong in supervision. I'm very strong in supervising math teachers. I'm very strong in supervising early childhood teachers. I know what to look for. I can go into a classroom and I can tell you right away if the students are learning. I can't say the same if I'm in a gym classroom or a music classroom. But part of this class is seeing how you can look at things from a curricular perspective and monitoring student engagement to really see if students are learning, which is one of the tenets that I'm hoping to pass to you. So their goal in this book really is you supervise to improve classroom practice and improve capacity for teachers. I can't say that enough, because if the teachers know what they're doing, it's less work for you. My research agenda, my life agenda is of the belief that the most important decision that a superintendent makes is who they hire as the building principal. The most important decision that a building principal makes is who they hire as their teachers. So this class really looks at teacher capacity. But it's also important to show how supervision has changed over the last 50 years, which is the first lecture. And that's something that I have a lot of experience with, because I've done a lot of research on the history of the principalship. So this is a dimension of the research that I've done, but it specifically looks at the history of supervision. And I think that's cool, and I think that's going to make for an interesting lecture. So the definition is the process of engaging instructional dialogue for the purpose of improving teaching and increasing student achievement, and that's their definition. It is not focused on instructional leadership or leadership. This is a big idea throughout the course. We're really talking about what the teachers can do and what you can do to support their progress and growth and help students learn better. It's why I like it. It's why I like this perspective. So supervision really has evolved and changed since the start of the educational system in the colonial times. Instructional responsibilities have changed. The responsibilities of school administrators have changed. How you supervise today is going to change 3, 5, 10 years from now, depending on the model that the state sets forth or even the federal government sets forth. So understanding the history of the practice only helps you move forward, and that will help you better improve when you're doing supervisions. So supervision began in medieval Latin and really was there for control. You'll find that mostly everything that we look at in education started out as control mechanisms, more to make sure that people were doing what they were supposed to do and punish than to actually help them improve. The supervisor was called an inspector, and that's key, because they inspected what the teachers were doing. They were ministers, selectmen, schoolmasters, and distinguished citizens. So if you were a noble person, you could come in and you could say, this is what the teacher is doing wrong, and this is what the teacher is doing right. And you had that say, and you had that right to do that. So early 19th century supervision, it was rural, unbureaucratic, and local authorities made the decisions. Supervisor would basically open the door, walk in, and say, okay, look, the teacher's there, good, the teacher's there. Then they close the door, and that's it. Nothing was correlated or had any focus on any type of instruction, which ended up being one of the challenges of the early supervision models. In the late 19th century was when we started the district movement. And for those of you that have taken the principalship, you've learned about this in your principalship class. You've learned how schools were formed, how they were organized. But really, supervision was necessary to make sure that teachers were doing their jobs appropriately. And superintendents were the supervisors that were in charge. And that was their responsibility to make sure that the bureaucracy issues with schools were handled appropriately. So inspection was the first method. The first textbook on supervision came out in 1875. And it really said that the supervisor was an expert instructor and they knew all. They knew what the teachers were doing, they knew if the teachers were doing something right, they knew if the teachers were doing something wrong, and they had the final say and authority. It was really to go into schools to make sure that work was happening appropriately. I look at this as very bureaucratic, but that's what it was. And it would get more bureaucratic as it evolved after that as well. So, Greenwood in 1891 said that, the skilled superintendent should judge from a compound sensation of the disease at work among the inmates. So really said that you inspected and make sure that the students weren't tying up their teacher, throwing things at them, and we were under the belief that teachers weren't competent, and you as the person in charge, you were there to fix them and to solve problems. Good idea in theory, right? I mean, you're the boss, you're there to fix and solve problems, but believing teachers, were competent really is something that should have happened, and it didn't in this situation. Schooling grew dramatically in the first decades of the 20th century. This is honestly because people were having more kids, more people had opportunities to go to school, and there were different types of supervisors that were used by schools because of that. Most of the time, a female supervisor was special that was hired by the building principal to help assist less experienced teachers. If you're sitting here thinking this is really the birth of teacher mentors. So if you're doing a dissertation on teacher mentorship, this is really where it came from, the early 20th century. Then a general supervisor was male, really worked more with the administrative subjects and then math and science. Once again, we see this, division between the work men do and the work women do in schools. And as we all know, that can be a problem and a challenge at times. So these people were referred to as snooppervisors, and I like that reference. They would report back to the district administrators and tell them information they needed on the teachers. It was done more to control them. So for those of you that are interested in the theory behind this, there's a theory by Foucault that's called panopticism that I use in a lot of my classes. Think about the movie and the book, George Orwell, 1984, the idea that Big Brother is watching you everywhere, even V for Vendetta. But this, this whole notion that really they're there to control you and anybody could be looking at you at any time and you wouldn't even know it. That's what supervision looked like at the time, and that's the model that was being used. So it was a control mechanism. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it right? Is it wrong? I don't know. I think it depends on the district and the organization. But I also think, that has evolved and changed. But it got worse. As we know, in the 1910s, 1920s, we had this factory model. So everybody worked and did output really based on factory efficiency. And this was bureaucratic methods for social efficiency, and this was scientific management and work theory. If you have managing educational organizations, we're going to talk a lot about scientific management and this origin and this birth. They took this idea that a worker is just a cog in a factory, and all that the worker does is they stress efficiency. They work a little at a time, they do what they need to do, but they are just there as a cog and they can be easily replaced. We took that model and we moved it into schools and said that supervisors should manage the same way that factories were managing. So we were managing our teachers like factory workers. Obviously right now, if you're watching this, you can see the problem with this. I see the problem with this, but it's a challenge that we have. So that was the bureaucratic method, and Yes, that existed, and yes, it was the case. So this stayed the effective model through the end of the 1920s. Teachers were more attacked than helped to be better teachers. And reading about this a little bit more in depth and knowing the work and org theory that I know, teachers were actually treated worse here than they were in the 1800s. In the 1800s, a supervisor came in and said, hey, how are you doing? Nobody's dead, you're good, thumbs up, goodbye. Here now, they're going in, they're saying, obviously these teachers need help, even if you didn't need help, and that was kind of the model that was used. So that's a problem I absolutely think. So we changed to a democratic model, you know, and not necessarily the Democratic Party, but the democratic model, which was, you know, the Dewey model, which you know from your foundations courses, that education is a democracy, that we need to do everything to improve instruction. Teachers need to have input on how to develop curriculum. Here's another big lesson that everybody needs to know, myself included. When something changes in education, teachers don't get empowered until the people above them, the principals, the central administrators, the superintendents, the school board, the state officials, until they let the empowering happen. Once they do, then we're good. But this was the model, this is what we suggested, but it took a while for the teachers to actually be empowered. Once they did, that led to better opportunities. So the teacher was a fellow worker. This would eventually transition into other roles in schools, but it was one of the first steps to ensure the transition into the supervision process. So scientific supervision was really more of a push for, you know, for this, you know, ways that we have measurements that are stuff that are efficiently linked to the curriculum. Is the teacher doing the objectives? In those measurements really were there in order to see how well the teachers provide their roles. Now, my opinion of this was it's a good step in the right direction, but the way that they went about this was freaking crazy. So if I was a supervisor, I would come in, I'd sit down, I'd just watch you teach, and I would just transcribe what you did by hand. I would just basically take this stuff that you were teaching, write it down, put it on a piece of paper, and wouldn't offer critique, but then I would go back and I would revisit it. So I was there just to basically be a video recorder. Then it was up to me to interpret it. So that was more scientific, we're moving in the right direction, but is it effective? Yeah, I think it depends on how it's interpreted, like everything else. So then we moved into the supervision as leadership, and this is the foundation of supervision that we see it today. And one of the goals, one of the things with this is really, these are, you know, the goals that really helps us find supervision as leadership, that we can improve our schools and our educational organizations. So we have this notion of developing mutually acceptable goals. Basically, this means that the school has a goal, or the principal has a goal, and the teacher has a goal, and you communicate it to each other. Easy. That's normally what we do in pre-observation conferences now in the United States. Cooperative and democratic methods of supervision. This is kind of the way where you can tell the principal, is there any, you know, the principal will ask you, and you should all ask your teachers, is there anything you want me to look for in this observation? The teacher can speak, and that can make a cooperative model. The goal of any of this should be to improve classroom instruction. You want to promote research into educational problems, meaning that the teachers are using best practice. If they're doing what's appropriate in our current decade, that matters more than, you know, what was appropriate 20 years ago. Passing out handouts and dittos and having people just fill sheets in, that's not going to work anymore. Professional leadership, it's giving teachers their own autonomy over their own classroom. I know, and all of you know, that is easier said than done. Some of you are working in districts right now where the teachers have complete autonomy, and everything is going good and everything's going well, and that's great. Some of you are working in districts right now that are under a lot of intense scrutiny. And the scrutiny that you're facing is, it's difficult because it's coming from the state, it's coming from the superintendent, and sometimes the principal's not going to want to give the teacher control when that happens. And we'll kind of talk about the notion of scripted lessons a little bit in here, and how you supervise those, but in some of those districts, that's kind of the direction we're going in. So clinical supervision, really, you know, it's the belief that we're looking for specific weaknesses in educational practice, so that if we had a prescribed formal process of a supervision model, then it's going to help people become better teachers. The problem is, who makes the decisions? In some cases, obviously we all want it to be collaborative, but you have to ask yourself, is it the teacher or is it the supervisor that's actually making the final decisions? And I think that depends on the organization. What I said in the last slide, I think districts that are under higher pressure, they're going to have less autonomy, and that's an issue that kind of comes along with this. And you have to consider that as well. So with democratic methods in supervision, teachers have more responsibility. They can govern schools themselves. Teachers have teacher empowerment. And a lot of people in our field really say that the word supervision is a disgusting term, so that we need to make the word, less bureaucratic, so it doesn't sound like they're being supervised, and teachers are being empowered more than anything else. So in our school system today, it's really standards-based teaching and learning. This is the influence of the curriculum in all facets of schools. Supervision has evolved as well. Really, your goal is to make sure that your teachers are meeting their standards, because the standards are tied to what the teachers should, the teachers should be teaching to the students. The students should be able to demonstrate is appropriate for their grade level, and the objectives are what the teacher states so that they can accomplish those goals. So you, as a supervisor, really need to know the standards. And coming from my context, I was a high school teacher for 7 years, and then I was an elementary school administrator. Big transition, big different change for that, but I found at the elementary level you really needed to go in and know what those kids had to know to be effective in kindergarten, first, second, third, and fourth, fifth grade, versus a different model where you're not as worried and you're not as concerned about that in high school, where I would say student engagement for some of these subject areas is more important. So I think what's interesting is this now has created this checklist model, which was going on in the 30s and 50s. So this whole model has gone full circle, meaning it's going to continue to. What I'm talking about today, I'm not going to talk about in 2 or 3 years. It's going to keep changing. It's why there's already been 4 editions of this textbook. The other one in the class, there's already been 9 editions of the textbook. It keeps changing. So I give you some notes from the authors. You can use this in your book, but I want to read these real quick and basically mention them. We are going to test for accountability by high stakes testing. It's not going anywhere. Don't think that it is. It's going to still be there. Schools, even with the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind, a lot of schools aren't standing anymore, and they've merged. They've been consolidated, and supervision was a way to kind of get those schools to go away. Standardized test scores to evaluate teachers is a problem, and this is why observation and instructional supervision can help, because you want to work in a model that it at least accounts for a little bit of how a teacher is evaluated, kind of that value-added component to things. The drive-bys to inspect what teachers do. A walkthrough to me is a drive-by, unless there's an actual purpose for it. When a principal walks in the room and says, "Can I sit down for 10 minutes?" I see teachers being on edge when that happens, especially when they're taking notes. That can be a problem. So we're really just inspecting. This is one that I got issues with, but it's the truth. We have administrators that have no experience and no training to supervise schools. That's the reality of the situation. Not a lot of people want to be principals. You're going into a field where you're going to get a job very quickly, and you know that, and you're going to make a lot more money than you are as a teacher. That's a good thing, but nobody wants your job. I don't want your job anymore. I used to want your job, but I did it, decided that the hours, the stress, the engagement was a little too much for me. My dissertation was on principal stress, and didn't necessarily care for a lot of the more challenging components of the position. So because of that, the end result is people become administrators that don't have training. They're granted permission to do this, and then they're told, well, now you have to supervise teachers. So we have top-down evaluative mechanisms or systems to rate teacher performance. And this is hypocritical of me to say this, because in this class, we're going to be looking at top-down evaluative mechanisms or systems to rate teacher performance. So we're going to be using in here, and that's what we're going to be exploring. So